If demography is destiny, are Republicans doomed? Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, there's a story in the New York Times, the paper of record, the Gray Lady, talking about how, the headline is, how voters turned Virginia from deep red to solid blue. And it focuses largely on the growth of immigrants and people of color flooding into burgeoning and blossoming suburban areas with dense populations that are increasingly voting with the Democrats. It's the New York Times, frankly, ignores the fact that most of the areas they're talking about are effectively suburban Washington, D.C., and a lot of the people in those areas are in careers in one way or the other deeply dependent upon the federal government, so one might expect that they would be in favor of a party that fosters the growth of the federal government. However, it's happening all over the country. We're looking here at my own Texas, where I live north of Dallas. And Bill, there seems to be this pattern. Largely conservative farmers sell their land for suburban subdivision development. Largely conservative governors recruit high-tech companies to start up or to move into the state. And those workers at those tech companies that consist not only of younger generation people, but also of immigrants from other countries, gradually change the state and those areas from red to blue. I guess what I'm wondering, Bill, is if you're a Republican, how do you ever break this cycle? It seems that it's going all in one direction.
Well, all of that is true. California being the prime example of what was once a golden state, now the most indebted state in the union. Its number one product is poverty. California produces, I think it's 40% of all the poverty in America comes from California, some number like that. So
now we may have some young viewers, Bill, who don't realize that California wasn't always solidly a blue state.
No, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and California ran surpluses when Ronald Reagan was governor. And when you run surpluses, you can actually say that you can provide things like free college, because even though college isn't free, the state is able to pay for it based on the interest on their surplus rather than have to not take anything out because of their interest on the debt. So what happens is California gets ruined by Californians. Californians leave California, and then they go and ruin other states as well. And all I have to say about this is, you're right, it is a huge issue, and it is almost impossible to do anything about that particular aspect of demographics. On the other hand, I have repeatedly spoken to the most progressive young people in the country and asked them why they do not sell their Xboxes or their cell phones in order to provide for those who are in greater need, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. None of them will do this. And the reason that matters is because as they start to get older, instead of expecting money coming to them from other people, instead of others' wealth being redistributed to them, they're going to start to notice that some of their wealth is being redistributed to other people, and then more and more and more of it. So people become more conservative as they get older. And that's just been the way things have been since humans have been here. But in a society like ours, where this entire generation has been absolutely insulated from any possible negative consequences, the fact that they're going to be looking for jobs, and then they're going to be paying jobs, and they're going to be hired for jobs, and then turning over 50% of their paycheck, that is going to change people back in the other direction. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I know that the state is a catastrophe. I know that San Francisco, arguably the most beautiful city in the country, maybe in the world, is now renowned around the planet and around the United States as the place where you can go and see people defecating in the streets. This is thanks to the Democrats. This is what the Democrats do. This is what the progressives do. This is what they've done with California, and this is what they're going to do everywhere they go. So since we've been living so well for so long, we've been living so much security, so much prosperity, so much, the wolves are so far from our door here that the only way that this is going to change is to allow it to continue. they'll vote themselves into blue states, and then they'll get governed like blue states. And all of the reasons that made Virginia and Texas attractive to live in the first place will be gone. And then these idiots will go someplace else and do the same thing. I am completely at the end of my rope as far as this is concerned. If there was one state that was conservative state that was willing to leave the union, I would move there tomorrow, and I would put up an extremely extensive border control on that republic, and I would be very careful about who I decided to let live there. That's what I would do.
Apparently, you would not have a reciprocity agreement with the people in California, so that they could travel freely across your borders.
No, they don't even get to travel. They're going to have to go around.
So it's interesting you bring up that particular example, because one of the people, you know how journalists will profile an individual that they think typifies the larger issue. And in this case, the New York Times spends a good deal of time profiling a man named Vijay Kotkari, who's 38 years old. He's a software engineer. He's doing fairly well. He drives a silver Tesla. And he's an immigrant to the United States. He said when he came to the USA, he was pretty sure that he thought he would be a Republican. And the reason was because of the Republican view of taxes, because of the Republicans' family values. And he says those things are close to our hearts. But he said, when he got here and he was going through the citizenship process and he talked to other people, he became discouraged by the way President Trump specifically speaks. And this is the quote. He said, "You get the feeling that you are separate," meaning you immigrant, are separate. And essentially, Vijay says President Trump made him a Democrat when he was inclined to be a Republican.
It's the New York Times. There is a psychological phenomenon I've been made aware of just very recently, and it's so recently that I'm not entirely sure I got the name right, but I'm pretty sure it's Gell-Mann amnesia. Here's how it works. If you've ever had a newspaper reporter ever show up on your property or do a story that was either about something that happened to you directly or do a story about something you have in-depth, deep knowledge about, what you find again and again and again and again and again is that the reporters not only make multiple mistakes, but they essentially more often than not get it exactly backwards. This is why reporters can go to the scene and, in Michael Crichton's words, come to the conclusion that wet streets generate rain. Now, when you have this happen, you realize that this person who's reported on this news story knows nothing at all about what they're talking about. But the amnesia comes in when you read the next story, and then you assume that the next story is written perfectly, logically, with integrity. You don't carry over your own confirmed observations that these people know nothing about what they're talking about. You can see it in areas where you have expertise, but when you go to the next story, you tend to believe that this story is accurately reported. So having graduated through this particular veil of psychological dynamics, I now realize that anytime I read anything from the New York Times, I'm going to put it in the same category as the illustration I saw of somebody shooting a revolver and having shells coming out of it. You know, looks good on paper, but I don't credit them with anything. I have no doubt that they were able to find an immigrant who came to America for low taxes and decided that Donald Trump was mean and that everybody, notice he said that I started talking to people at the, wherever the hell he started talking to them
Other
about.
people who were going through the citizenship process.
Okay. Well, he's going to be making some money, presumably. And when he makes some money, he will then find out whether or not he is willing to sacrifice 50% of his income in order
he
to
is, Bill. I
assuage.
told you, he's driving a Tesla. He lives in a nice house. He lives in suburban Virginia. Things are going well for him. I guess, are you saying that the New York Times cherry-picked this guy, but the guy is not typical, and that, in fact, new immigrants coming into the country who love the Republican position on taxes and family values are, in fact, more inclined to join the Republican Party?
I think that you can pretty clearly determine, based on all of the evidence that I've ever seen, that whether or not you come to America and decide to become a Republican or a Democrat is going to depend very highly on where you're coming from and what you did when you were there. Actually, not so much important where you're coming from, so much as what you did when you were there. If you are a person coming to America who is a success in your own country, these people overwhelmingly vote Republican because they're trying to get away from the corruption and the high taxes and the government controls and all the rest of it that made their lives untenable wherever they may be coming from. But if you're the kind of person that wants to come here and have all these benefits, that's great. Now, I understand this guy's working, he drives a Tesla, and that's grand, and all the rest of it, fine. That's fine. Maybe he is willing to pay 50% of his taxes in order to, of his income in taxes in order to maintain this belief system. But I don't really care. Look, when I was in debate in high school, I learned the most important lesson that I have learned in my entire life ever. And that was simple. It didn't just affect politics. It affected every decision and every possible thought I've had since then. When I was in high school in debate, I was on the debate team. I know it's going to come as a shock. And I was in a position where I would have a topic. My partner and I would have a topic for that year, and that particular year was prison reform. And then I would have a case where I would say that the death penalty actually reduces the murder rate. And I could come up with cases of evidence on index cards showing study after study after study that showed that the death penalty, when applied quickly and fairly realistically, routinely almost, that lowers the homicide rate. And then a half an hour later, I would be on the other side of the issue, and I'd be going up against somebody else who had a plan, and their plan was also to include the idea that the death penalty lowers crime. So then I had another briefcase that had exactly the same number of experts who said exactly the opposite thing. Precisely the opposite thing. I could give you 10 studies that said that it lowers the murder rate. I could give you 10 studies that says that it doesn't. So the question then becomes, what is common sense and what is actually going to happen? I think it is inconceivable to me that Donald Trump, who won an election in 2016, coming off of Barack Obama, who during 8 years increased the standard of living for average Americans by $1,400, something like that, over 8 years. I find it inconceivable that Donald Trump, who won that election, despite all the unknowns, who has produced $5,400 in family income growth in 3 years. I find it hard to believe that every single person in America thinks that it's absolutely swell to vote for the Democrats and their policies. I just don't believe it. I've seen what they do with other stories. I've seen how they cover things I know something about. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I believe they found a guy. There's no question I believe that. But I don't believe the entire premise. And I have so frequently seen the New York Times in particular make assertions and could draw conclusions, suppress stories, all of this. I have seen them do it for so long that I simply don't care. Now, if it turned out that you were telling me that this information was compiled by the Salt Lake City Intelligencer or whatever, I would give it more considerate thought than I do coming from the New York Times, because I think there are still some newspapers in this country that have some shreds of credibility left, but not that one.
Well, unfortunately, Bill, we recently did an episode about the Salt Lake Tribune, which is being turned into a nonprofit organization. And
right.
When you said laudatory things in general about the people of that area and their tendency to be more conservative, we had a bunch of viewers who pointed out that the Salt Lake Tribune has essentially been a blueberry in a bowl of tomato soup for a long time.
Well, then to hell with them.
So yes,
but by the way, that's why they're out of business.
Well, yeah, that's why actually they're becoming.
That's why they're a charity case.
So
just like every other newspaper in the country is going to be a charity case.
So let me ask you just a final question here, and this is kind of on a broader perspective. We've talked on this show and on Right Angle at BillWhittle.com from time to time about the idea that there's a difference in the way people think when they live in densely populated areas compared with those who live out in more open or more rural areas. And I'm wondering, as the demographic trends continue, as the percentage of immigrants, especially especially from Asian and Indian origins, come into the country, and they populate around these, sort of ex-urban, just outside of the city areas, and within these cities, some of the renewed neighborhoods. Has the GOP really boxed itself in with this kind of rugged individualism approach that seems more suited to, Abe Lincoln with an axe out in a cabin in the woods than it does with a society where you are heavily dependent upon the functioning of at least local government and probably the federal government as well? Have we essentially put ourselves into this almost a Thomas Jeffersonian mold of an agrarian republic that just doesn't exist or cannot in the future win elections?
I have yet to meet an immigrant who's come to the United States in order to get increased bureaucracy.
And yet, Republicans seem to be struggling in these collar counties, do they not?
Says the New York Times.
Well, you can look at the data. I mean, I can look at Philadelphia. I saw the actual data when I was in Pennsylvania. It's Republicans are essentially bleeding out in these collar counties, and they've already lost the cities. So the question is, do we need to reevaluate whether our approach really appeals to a kind of American that is in dwindling supply?
Well, isn't that just precisely the antithesis of what the conservative idea is? You're saying, shouldn't we tailor our philosophy and our morality to appeal to people, to make ourselves more popular with people based on the whims of the moment? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm not calling for a situational ethics. What I'm saying is that the message that comes from the Republican Party doesn't seem to be one that's tailored to meet the needs or to resonate with the real lived experience of people who live in areas where there are subways and, where people are heavily dependent upon cooperative action, normally coordinated by government, where there are many people who are on government support of one way or another. It's a different life, is it not?
It is. And let me tell you why I'm not worried about this. First of all, if we were entering the 19th century, I'd be worried about this, but we're not. And what I mean by that is, as the industrial age continues to pass, the entire reason for cities disappears. The reason you need large cities is during the industrial era with factories, you have to have all of the goods and all of the workers in one place so that they can take the iron, move it to the smelter, run it across town, move it through the presser, move it across town, move it to the car maker, and ship it out. That's what you need cities for. And what we're finding now in the information age is more and more and more people, especially upscale people who are making money, leave the cities. I know somebody, I have a friend who is a big old liberal, who is absolutely gigantic progressive, and he left California and he moved to Utah, and he loves it there. He loves it there because there's no crime. He loves it there because people are friendly. He loves it there because taxes are low. I didn't take the time to explain to him how hypocritical all of this is. But my point is this economy that we're looking at now is an economy where cities no longer make the kind of sense that they used to make economically. There is no reason to live in a city anymore. And my experience with just about everybody is if they've had a chance to live in downtown Los Angeles, and there is no downtown Los Angeles, but basically if they've lived in LA County and have an opportunity to live someplace else, they'll take someplace else. And so what's happening is this entire dynamic of cities is falling apart. And I think this more than counterbalances what they're talking about. If the only cure for socialism, Scott, the only cure for these progressive tendencies is to implement them. That's the only cure for them, is to implement them. You want your socialism? Fantastic. Here you go. I live in a state.
It would be nice if you could do that in the way that people are inoculated against diseases by using a dead strain of the virus instead of a live one.
That's what Bernie Sanders is. Bernie Sanders is a dead strain of the communist virus. He's all of the hokum and none of the terror necessary to enforce that kind of economic system on people. And look, I've been writing for months now. I've been writing a 10-part podcast on the Cold War, which is going to open in January, and no matter what you say about it, if your socialist world is a world that has to build walls to keep people in other words, if socialism requires building a wall so that our own people don't go to the other camp, then that society and that system will not last. The Soviet Union didn't fall by accident. It wasn't an accident. It was sheer terror that kept it alive as long as it did. But as long as there was any other country in the world that was a capitalist country, the Soviet Union was doomed. And so when people come to me with these New York Times articles about how the Republicans are finished and how all of this is done and America is just a giant socialist country, I go back to things like this. And I realize that after 8 years of Barack Obama and unbelievable indoctrination, you remember when the Tonight Show used to be about like guests and comedy, not like Stephen Colbert's latest take on the impeachment proceedings or Seth Meyers or any of these people. Remember those days? Well, I have found that people don't want this politicization of everything, and especially young people have seen it chase them into video games and into movies, and they don't want it. Nobody wants it. So if they're so determined to get it, then I say give it to them. That's why I live in California. I get us all the time. Why do you live in California, Bill? Why don't you come live in the United States? You'd love it in America. I would. I very much would love it in America. But that's not where I need to be. I need to be underneath this volcano of insanity, because this is where I can pick up the first tremors of watching this entire thing slide into the ocean, which is what it's going to take. You cannot, people are not built. They are not built to do the smart and the right thing at the same time. 1% of the population, maybe 10% of the population, has the discipline and the common sense to save their money, to build up resources, to have enough food to last them for 10 days or 20 days without a generator and all the rest of it. There's 1%, 10% of the people in this country, or really in any country, have that kind of discipline and common sense. The rest of us stumble through the world, and when disaster strikes, that gets our attention. And so we had a slow motion disaster with Barack Obama over 8 years with 1% economic growth. That was the new normal. So it was impossible for the country's economy to grow any faster than that. Donald Trump comes in, cuts taxes, and whammo. In 3 years, the standard of living is gone up by $5,000 for the average family against $1,400 over 8 years of Obama. So the laws of physics are on my side. The laws of demographics may or may not be on their side. But if the New York Times is trumpeting it this loud, let's not forget that this is the same newspaper that is calling for Michael Bloomberg to become the guy who comes in and rescues the Democrats from themselves. So I think the whole thing is just a gigantic piece of propaganda designed to do what they always do, which is to make you, the person watching this right now, think that you're the last person in the world who believes the way you do, that everything that you believe in is obsolete and way of the dinosaurs, that it's already over, as you're just a remnant of history just waiting to die. And I hate to break it to them, but we're still here. And not only are we still here, we are going to make a much stronger showing than we did in 2016, and that's going to drive them even more insane. And the more insane they get, the more people in the middle are going to realize that a political party that is willing to put the feelings of one male athlete who feels like a woman today above 9, 10, 20 million female athletes is a party that doesn't deserve to have any kind of national influence whatsoever.
Every once in a while, I look at a heat map of where the visitors are coming from to BillWhittle.com, and I've always been heartened to see that they come from everywhere across the country and in many countries around the world. Obviously, the United States of America is the main audience here, but we see people from inner city New York City. We see people from the heartland of America out in the middle of what the New Yorkers might consider nowhere, and all across the country. So it's really exciting to see that there are many people still willing to engage the ideas of the left based on the principles of conservatism that have carried this country thus far. And we're grateful for those people, especially who become members, to fund this enterprise. I frequently remind our members when they write into us, Bill, that when you are subscribing at BillWhittle.com, it's not like you're paying for videos. Frankly, most of the videos are available widely without a membership. The people who become members at BillWhittle.com are doing so to provide these videos for other people who have not yet come into the fold.
They're not consumers of videos, they're producers of videos. They're not paying to get access to the videos. They're paying so that the videos can be made and be spread for free as widely as possible. They're not clients or customers, they're producers.
So they're part of this team, and we are grateful to them for making that possible. If you'd like to make it possible for other people to hear messages like this, which you're not going to find from flipping around the dial on the TV from the mainstream news media, we think that your contribution here is money well spent, because we will spread this to thousands of people across the country and also around the world. It's also encouraging, by the way, Bill, to see the notes from people who are hoping someday to immigrate to the United States, and they are cutting their teeth on this kind of content.
We have a person who's been a regular fan and commentator from Lithuania. He's coming here in early spring, and he's getting married in April. And I decided I was going to go out there and be there at his wedding ceremony. He's an American who was born overseas, and it's not his fault. He's found his way home, and I mean to give him the kind of reception that he deserves. If I could do it for every single one of them, I would. But that's a really important point. And I also happen to be married to an American who was born overseas. And if you want to call the New York Times reporter, I could show you an immigrant who came to America, thinks Donald Trump is just absolutely the bomb, doesn't understand why Democrats have ruined everything good about this state, and is absolutely outraged at the criminality involved with the people who read the New York Times.
And I could show you a couple of thousand people like that who are members at BillWhittle.com. We are grateful for their ministrations to this enterprise, for their making it possible, in fact. So feel free to share this opportunity, which you can do from our website. And if you have not yet become a member, click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.